Hey mamas, most births don't start off like Hollywood might make you believe. Although most movies or shows show women's water releasing and then them rushing off to the hospital in a desperate hurry for fear that their baby won't wait that long, that doesn't typically happen unless it's like a third or fourth baby and your body just really knows the drill. However, sometimes labor does start with the rupturing of membranes or the water breaking before contractions have started. This happens in about 6% of labors, and if it happens, there are a few things that you should know to help keep you and your baby healthy and prepare you for your labor and birth, and that's what we're talking about in this video right now. I'm Bridget, and I'm a birth doula and childbirth educator in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I love educating and empowering mothers through their pregnancies, births, and motherhood. If you're new here and want to be informed, empowered, and encouraged, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. When your water releases before you start experiencing consistent surges, it might be a little alarming and catch you off guard. You might even assume that you peed your pants at first because it's just so out of the blue. Sometimes when you're caught off guard like that, it's easy to react in fear rather than respond confidently to the situation. So by the end of this video, you will know how to respond confidently so that you can take the best care of yourself and your baby. So in some cases, if your membranes rupture when you are at term, meaning 37 weeks or more, that can be totally normal. As your baby becomes more developed and your pregnancy starts coming to an end, the sac that's sort of like a balloon and that's surrounding your baby and keeps all that fluid in begins to weaken. Sometimes as a result of that weakening amniotic sac, your water starts releasing, and if that happens, there are a few things that you should note. The first thing that you're going to want to look out for and take note of to share with your care provider is the amount of fluid that is leaking. For some women, it will be a light trickle, and for others, it will be a gush, and you might even feel a slight pop as it happens. Usually when it's a small amount of fluid that just makes your underwear a little bit wet, you're likely to have a high leak, which is a small hole near the top of your amniotic sac. But your amniotic sac, besides that small hole, is still intact. A good way to determine if it's amniotic fluid or just pee is by doing the stand-up test. If each time you stand up, you notice more leaking, which can happen whether you have a small hole or your water has completely been released, it's likely amniotic fluid. A lot of times when you're sitting or lying down, you won't notice anything because it's all pooling in the vagina. Then once you stand up and the vagina straightens out, it will all come out. So again, if this is happening, try to gauge how much fluid it is. You don't need to measure anything, but simply note whether it's just a trickle that wets your underwear or panty liner, or if it's a gush that left a puddle on the floor or soaked your pants. The second thing you'll want to be aware of is the color of the fluid. Amniotic fluid is normally a clear, sometimes yellow tinted fluid. Now, if you're a well-hydrated person, it might be hard to tell the difference between your pee that is practically clear and your amniotic fluid that is also practically clear. But the color of the fluid isn't so much to differentiate between pee or amniotic fluid as much as it is to check for meconium stained fluid, which usually comes out looking kind of greenish or brownish. Meconium is what baby poops out for the first few bowel movements, and if they make their first bowel movement while they're still in the womb, it may get into their lungs and can possibly cause breathing issues after birth that they will need treatment for. So really the big thing to look for when you're observing the color of the fluid is whether it is close to clear or looking a little green or brown. The third thing that you're going to want to observe is the odor of the fluid. Amniotic fluid should come out smelling pretty much odorless or sometimes, and weirdly enough, even a little bit sweet. If you notice your amniotic fluid smelling foul, then it could mean that there is an infection that your care provider would want to look into as soon as possible. Some women say that it smells a little bit like bleach, but typically that acidic like ammonia smell is actually from pee and not the amniotic fluid. So if you feel like your amniotic fluid is leaking or you're thinking that your water broke, those are things that you'll want to pay careful attention to so that you can relay that information information on to the nurse, doctor, or midwife that you're in communication with. You definitely should notify your provider right away if you think you are leaking amniotic fluid. Now, it's not unheard of that women mistake peeing themselves for their water releasing. I just had a mama who called me the other day telling me that she thought her water broke, and I, along with the nurses who she was talking to and even her OB, thought it truly was her water until they swabbed her vagina and found no evidence for it being amniotic fluid. So peeing yourself as you get closer to your baby's arrival is pretty common due to a weak pelvic floor and the pressure of baby's head against your bladder. So if you find out that it's pee and it's not amniotic fluid, don't be embarrassed. It happens to a lot of mamas out there. Now, in order to determine what the fluid is, your healthcare professional can do a few different things. One way they may check to see if it's amniotic fluid if mama's cervix is soft and dilated enough is to feel for the bag of water. If they feel that the bag of water is intact, they know your water hasn't been completely released. However, there is still a chance that you are leaking from a hole at the top of the uterus, like I mentioned earlier. So sometimes you'll be given an ultrasound to check out the levels of your fluid. If it's low, that's a good indication that you might be leaking. And then often the way you'll be checked is by placing a sterile speculum, which is like that duckbill looking tool that can help open up the vagina to see if any pooling of fluid can be seen in the vagina or if visible fluid is leaking from the cervix. If a healthcare professional sees the actual trickling, it's likely that it is amniotic fluid. But to be sure, they're usually going to take a sterile cotton swab, get a sample of the fluid, and then make sure that it's actually amniotic fluid. And then the last way, which I think is the coolest way to check whether or not it's amniotic fluid, is by using a special swab that changes color depending on the pH of the fluid. If it's yellow, it's not amniotic fluid, and if it's blue, then it is amniotic fluid. And you can actually buy these tests on Amazon called Amnicheck water break detection kits, which might be valuable if you are having a home birth, but your midwife would definitely have these herself too if that's how she checks for amniotic fluid, so not something that you need. They are FDA approved and 99% accurate. However, the risk in you checking it yourself is increased risk for infection if your water is actually broken and you're not super careful. Plus, just because you've checked doesn't mean your nurse, doctor, or midwife doesn't need to check. So if your water has been released, you'll want to be really careful about how many times different hands or tools are being placed in your vagina because each time it happens, risk of infection increases. So if it's confirmed that it is indeed your amniotic fluid, there are a few different options, and depending on the birth that you are hoping for, you'll make different decisions. If your amniotic fluid looks clear and healthy and you are healthy and your baby is healthy, there isn't necessarily a huge push for an induction right away. In fact, about 45% of women who experience their water releasing before their surges begin will likely go into spontaneous labor within 12 hours. And between 77 and 95% of women will go into labor within 24 hours. Now, if you are a first-time mama, it can take even longer than 48 hours to go into labor, but research tells us that of women who were allowed to go up to 72 hours after their waters had released, 83% went into labor on their own and had vaginal births. And these statistics are all from evidence-based birth, which I will link down below in the description. However, one thing you need to consider is that as the length of time increases between your water releasing and your baby being born, the risk of infection also increases, which is often why your care provider will want labor to begin shortly after your membrane has ruptured, if you are near or beyond 37 weeks pregnant. When working with mamas, I always encourage them to make decisions based on the evidence they have in front of them, and this is definitely one of those cases, and the evidence you want to see is, am I healthy and is my baby healthy? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then there isn't necessarily a big necessity to induce labor right away, as long as you understand the risks for waiting. As I said, most women will go into labor on their own within 24 to 48 hours. In the biggest study done on cases where women's water broke when she was 37 or more weeks before contractions started, women who waited for labor to start on its own were more likely to have an infection. However, with that being said, this study probably overdiagnosed infection in women who were a part of this study. Now, the signs that point to an infection defined in this study were mama's temperature being over 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit at least 2 times more than an hour apart, or any single temperature where mama was over 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, or an extremely high white blood cell count, or foul-smelling amniotic fluid. So any of those things in this study was considered evidence for infection. When the standards of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the American Academy of Pediatrics both say infection is determined by a fever and at least 1 or 2 of those other factors. So it's hard to say whether or not that big study was super accurate about diagnosing infections in those labors that started on their own. And all that to say that there isn't a definitive answer on whether you will get an infection or not, which is why it's important to make a decision based on the evidence that you are given at the time. So for example, if you are GBS positive, you are already at higher risk of infection for yourself and your baby. So you might need to be at the hospital to receive antibiotics, be monitored, and hope that labor starts soon, or it may need to be induced. However, if you and your baby are looking totally healthy, you can choose whether you want to wait or start labor by induction. If you are giving birth at a hospital, they may not want you to go back home after your water breaks, or some hospitals may clear you to go home after instructing you on how to look for signs of infection. Whatever the scenario is, you always have a choice, and you should always ask all of your questions, raise your concerns, and let your care provider know exactly what you want so that you can openly work together with clear communication on what each other's goals and expectations are for labor and birth. One of my favorite birth stories right now is a mama whose water broke 6 weeks before her due date and went into the hospital after texting me about thinking her fluid was leaking. And I told her, why don't you just talk to your care provider, see what they want to do. And upon confirming it was a small leak of her amniotic fluid, they told her that they were going to need to perform a C-section because they couldn't induce her due to a previous C-section that she had. And she did her homework though, and according to a Cochrane review, which I will link down below, found that in women whose waters break before 37 weeks of pregnancy, waiting for labor to begin naturally is the best option for healthier outcomes, as long as there are no other reasons why the baby should be born immediately. So using the evidence that she had that everything looked healthy for her and her baby, she decided to wait and ended up waiting 10 days before her labor naturally started, and her baby boy was eventually born vaginally, totally healthy and totally safe. And I shared this story to remind you mamas that you and your care team can work together to help you get the birth that you desire. But sometimes it takes you and your birth team to speak up and advocate for your preferences, and then sometimes make compromises on those things. This mama whose story I just shared had to stay in the hospital for those 10 days as a compromise for waiting for labor to begin naturally. But she was able to have a completely unmedicated vaginal birth as a result. So I know that she loved that she was able to work with her care team, make those compromising decisions, but was able to have the beautiful birth that she had in the end. So if your water breaks, don't feel like your whole birth experience is out of your hands now. The first thing that you can do to be involved in this process is to know all of those things that I mentioned at the beginning of this video: the amount of the fluid, the color, and the odor of the fluid. And then when you're assessed to make sure it really is amniotic fluid, you'll be the one making the decisions based on the evidence that's before you for the kind of birth that is right for you and your baby. Mamas, if you have found this video about your water breaking and kind of what to do and what to look for helpful, and you think other mamas need to see it, make sure you give it a thumbs up so that YouTube sees that and lets other mamas see it as well. So mamas, I hope this video helps you know what you can do and what to expect if your water breaks unexpectedly before contractions begin. More than anything, I hope that you feel empowered through whatever kind of birth experience you have by being the one who makes the decisions for you and your baby, and that those decisions are respectfully listened to, and that you and your care team work together beautifully to support you during this incredibly important time. So thanks for being with me in this video, mamas, and I will see you in the next one.